Hello, welcome to another Atlantic Council Geotech Hour. I'm your host, Dr. David Bray, Director of the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center, and I'm really excited today because we have a great panel here to discuss space economics, building sustainable space infrastructure. Commercial space is dramatically advancing in terms of technology and data capabilities, and this is changing the underlying economics of what we can do in space, how we can sustain it, and where we can go as a planet together. Again, I'm excited to bring these panelists to this conversation, and I'm looking forward to their views in shaping how we can make sure we go forward as open societies and entrepreneurs in the future of space. I'd like to turn first to Dr. Reggie Brothers. Reggie, real quick, could you briefly introduce yourself for our audience, and could you talk about what has changed? Why are we really talking about sustainable space now, and why does it matter?
David, first, thanks for having me. I really appreciate being here. I'm the CEO of New Wave Solutions. It's a custom software development company focused on providing predictive analytic solutions. And my career has pretty much been entirely in the science technology arena, government and industry. For example, I was the Undersecretary for Science Technology at DHS. I was a technical fellow at BAE Systems, and I had a successful startup company in wireless communications. One of the things to start with, David, is kind of why is some of this important, to give some context. This is important because if you think about the global commons, right? The global commons being those natural resources that everyone has access to, that are shared. So if you think about it, these global commons are the high seas, the atmosphere. Cyberspace is now a global commons, and so is outer space. And what's happening because of some of the occurrences, some of the advances that we'll be talking about, space is now a domain of communication, of commerce, and potentially of conflict. And because of that, just like we do with the other global commons, we have sustainable infrastructures to ensure commerce, communication, and national security interests. We need the same thing in space. So I think from a context perspective, that's why this is an important discussion. Then if we want to get into, why is this happening now? Technologies, space capabilities, right? So for example, some of the more expensive aspects of space are launch. And we know that there's several players in space launch right now that's really brought down the cost of launch 20 times in some cases, particularly for LEO orbits, right? The other thing is not just the launch, but it's using commercial technologies, electronics. It's using so-called ground stations as a service, which I think we'll hear about later. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the philosophies that kind of went into the way of thinking about designing space systems, of designing space architectures in the past, they were based really on a different model than we're doing right now, right? The original model was one of where you're thinking about putting up a system probably in a geostationary orbit, which is expensive to launch to versus some of the lower orbits. You're looking at extremely expensive bus architecture, extremely expensive payloads to get a very high performance. You're looking at decades of lifetime, which requires potentially decades of design, test, and evaluation, which is all very expensive. And the other thing to add is dedicated stovepipe ground terminals as well. So you put all that together, and you've got a very expensive system that could take a long time to develop, and is equally hard to refresh technology at the rate that technology changes. So if you think about a newer model, right, this is one that's more based on consumer electronics, consumer products, where much shorter lifetimes, LEO, low Earth orbits, which are cheaper to get into. This is where we're using commercial electronics. Again, these electronics aren't necessarily radiation hardened. Some of the systems don't necessarily have the same kind of performance in terms of high resolution, high data rates, these kinds of things. But that said, when you start developing these proliferated systems, lots of satellites in LEO, you can start aggregating these things such that you get equivalent kind of performance in the aggregation of that. Not only that, you get more resilient and reliable systems because of the redundancy, right? So I think those are some of the reasons that we're at this point right now. And a quick example, if you don't mind, David, mm-hmm. When I was at DHS, one of my concerns was the fact that because of the opening of the Arctic, because of climate change conditions, we're seeing a lot more traffic, both commercial as well as military traffic. And search and rescue is one of the missions of the U.S. Coast Guard, which is part of DHS. And as such, the current system that's being used is an old system. In fact, it ages out sometime this decade. So one of the things I wanted to do was develop a satellite system to really mitigate that gap until the newer so-called MEOSAT system is in place. And we were able to do that, right? We were able to do that in a couple of years with I think about $10 million or so, a little more than $10 million.
Wow.
We're able to use the CubeSat technologies that we can talk about, commercial electronics, commercial sensing systems, and low-cost ground terminals to get this all done in a short period of time. So I think that's an example of how a government agency can use these kind of commercial technologies and this new model of thinking about systems and architecture to put an economic system in place in the near term.
So that's a fascinating sort of setting the scene, Reggie. And if I could ask, maybe is this equivalent in your mind of how we used to have, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, like Cray supercomputers and things like that were very boutique and very expensive. And now what we're looking at is you can build this using off-the-shelf graphics cards and Raspberry Pis and have equivalent, if not faster performance using commercial hardware versus things that used to be very exquisite and very boutique. Is that where we're going?
I think that's where we're going, right? And I think as the conversation goes on, we can start talking to what does that mean regarding access, right? So in your example, how many people had those computers, right? There's very few people had those computers. But now my daughter plays with a Raspberry Pi, right? So, the access is increased exponentially because of the kinds of things that you're talking about.
Excellent. Thank you, Reggie. I'd now like to turn to Peter Canito. You've been looking at this space as well, and you've been tracking. So I'm going to ask you the same question. What has changed? Why are we talking about this now? And why, most importantly, does this matter?
Yeah, so thank you, David. So my name is Peter Canito, as you stated, and I'm currently chairman and CEO of Redwire Space, which is a private equity-backed space company focused on developing the next generation space infrastructure. So this is obviously something we spend a lot of time thinking about. And, I think what's changed, although it's been more of an evolution than a revolution, and people are really just starting to wake up to it, is really the size of the economic impact that space has in our economy overall and in the world economy overall. JP Morgan says that the space industry will be $1.1 trillion by 2040. That's a really large number, but economists who talk about the impact of space, one of the debates or dialogues that it always gets into is where to mark the beginning and the end in terms of measuring that. Is it literally just if it is in space, then that's counted in that industry? Or should we include every industry that has a dependency on GPS? Well, I would submit that if you include every industry that has a dependency on GPS, 1.1 trillion starts to look really small. Right. And I think that underscores as to why this is a really important conversation to be having now, because quite frankly, the economics of space is really about the economy of the nation and then largely the economy of the world as well. They're really becoming that coupled now as we continue to build out this space infrastructure. So that we're really at kind of a point now where I think you're going to see an explosion in developing space infrastructure. There are many things that you can do in space that we have traditionally done terrestrially that, quite frankly, you can do more efficiently in space. And so whereas, in some underdeveloped nations, for instance, where you might have tried to put a telecommunications infrastructure in place terrestrially before, we can just skip that step in the evolution and go right to space. So all of this taken together, whether we can debate on whether it's 1.1 trillion and where to draw the line, the point really is that the space economy is so critical to our current and future economy that we have to be very smart about how we go about developing it. And what's interesting is, and we talk about the word sustainable, is not only, I like to say sustainable and responsible economic growth in space, because what I believe is happening is really a new industrialization of space. That's where we're headed. And the world has seen industrial progress in the past, and we have a lot of very interesting insights and lessons learned from going through these stages of industrialization. So we have to be very smart, and we should be very smart because we're much more informed than we were, say, previously through other industrializations of different aspects of our economies about how we do that from both a legal, environmental, social, and economic perspective. So a lot of thought needs to go in on that, and there's a lot of ideas because this is all very new, and it's being done in the backdrop of things that I think Reggie really did a good job of highlighting, with the backdrop of where we are, not only from a shared commons perspective, from a cybersecurity and resilience perspective, as well as how nations are going to behave and interact and both collaborate and compete in space. And that convergence of stuff is making this a very complex environment, but also one that has a lot of opportunity. And specifically, one of the trends that we've been following is the openness of traditional space stakeholders, primarily driven heretofore by the government, of having kind of a new open-minded approach to how to think about space from a commercialization perspective, and also to look at new models, new business models for driving our industrialization and expansion and ultimately commercialization of space. And that's a very exciting dynamic that's going on here as well. So lots to talk about.
Excellent, Pete. And I really liked how you highlighted both why are we talking about this now, and important you also drew out we need to be aware of sustainability and mindfulness given the challenges of space debris and how that can become a challenge. And also what you said, though, is also thinking about how we make sure it's not stovepiped going forward. So maybe to sort of help real quick paint the picture for our audience, is this similar to how, with the early industrial revolution involving coal, there was lots of soot, and we had smog, we had soot on buildings. Is this making sure that we don't have that happen in space and trying to be sort of almost ahead of the curve wherever possible to make sure that space continues to be usable for all? And like you said, though, figuring out what are the rules of the road, given that there's only so much low Earth orbits that are available. And if everybody wants to get up there, it can get very crowded very fast.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. We have a lot of lessons learned from history on how to go about it right, areas that we've stumbled on previously that I think we can benefit from as we kind of venture into the expansion. If you think about moving into the new world as analogous, and how we expanded during that exploration period, that dramatic growth and exploration. Well, we have a new equivalency in space as we talk about a permanent outpost on Mars, as we talk about continuing to build infrastructure out in orbit, and then ultimately putting people out throughout the solar system. We have a lot of lessons learned that we can benefit, so we can do it right and better the second time, while still maintaining the economic prosperity that comes with that kind of expansion.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Pete. Now I'd like to go to Joanne Lowe. Joanne, can you real quick introduce for our audience? I know you have a depth of experience when it comes to both working in the defense space and entrepreneur space, and then sort of setting the scene. What has changed and why does this matter? Maybe you could actually help share a lens both as an entrepreneur and as someone who works in the defense communities too.
Sure. Thank you, David, for having me join this panel. So a little bit about my background. I worked for the DOE and DOD for national labs for many years in my career. And then I started my own company, Elysium Labs. We make AI assistants for a multi-domain warfighting environment for the DOD. And from that, obviously, a lot of commercialization too. So that's kind of my background and where I'm coming from. And when we talk about the space domain, what is really interesting to me is that in this existing ecosystem, we're starting to see more and more private companies entering the space domain. So we can no longer rely on having countries or large entities to negotiate the collaboration model. And this whole process really reminded me of how the makerspace developed a long time ago, which obviously enabled a lot of new technologies to enter multiple spaces on Earth, and accelerated a lot of different types of development. And we see policies start to lag behind as innovations start to grow exponentially. So this is a good time to start having this conversation, because as you see more tankers to enter, then you're going to see more startup companies having the resources and the knowledge to start companies in this space. And we're going to start companies not only in things that we're imagining now, right? 5 years later, we're going to doing things in space that we are not even aware right now, right? So right now we're talking about things like infrastructure, we're talking about space stations, we're talking about plants, we're talking about things that, maybe NASA or bigger companies have been working on for years, and rightfully so, because we're relying on institutional knowledge to grow those things. But as the space domain becomes more open to the public, we are going to see. So I have a friend who works on 3D printing in space, and she works on multiple different materials to print anything that you can imagine in space, right? And on Earth, that is starting to be deployed in DoD setting. And so you can imagine in about 5 years, we're going to start talking about doing that in space. What is that going to enable, right? And so as we have countries and private entities starting to pay more attention in space and see different ways that the economy can work for them, we're all going to get a little more aggressive and less collaborative when it comes to development and collaboration. So before we enter that stage, I think it is important for policymakers to start thinking about how do we create a sustainable space infrastructure so that we can protect American interests in a way that jives with the rest of the world as well. And in doing so, we need to really understand that we're operating in a completely new landscape, and that we have a new collaborative space. Everybody is next to each other, is kind of like asking a whole bunch of people who previously didn't really get along and living in different houses, and now you squish them into this giant mansion with no limits. So it's a big ask, because we're all going to be exploring, we're all going to be uncovering problems, and it's important to understand what American interest means for the government as well as for private entities before we enter this space. So.
Very well said. And I liked how you pointed out that there may be both exploration and possibly some competition that might actually become aggression. I mean, it's worth noting, Pete was talking about the analogy of this is like the New World. Well, the New World had great explorers, but it also had, unfortunately, some wars, some atrocities, unfortunately, and then the Wild West was kind of wild for a while there. So I'm kind of wondering what the equivalent of the Great Train Robbery will be in space, but I can actually imagine there might be some interesting things there. So Joanne, real quick, because you talked about the makerspace, are there anything that we can draw from what happened in the makerspace that was sort of a way of, instead of trying to do either top-down regulation or something like that, is there anything that maybe could be some signposts for how we might be able to approach space better, or anything that you might recommend there?
Sure. So the way I look at the makerspace is that is really a whole bunch of smart and passionate people trying to do different things, and they are allowed a huge leeway to fail, which is what enabled them to grow. I approach the makerspace as almost like a institutional person, right? Like I'm not that person in a garage, but I've always been college educated, government paid for college educated. And then I go back to look at this makerspace. And I've always seen them as a tremendous source of inspiration for how things would go. And so that we can anticipate problems before we come up. One thing that I've learned about the makerspace is that traditionally they have not been included in a lot of top level conversation. because they don't talk in the same way as top level people do. And I'm not saying that top level policymakers need to start talking like makers, or makers need to start talking like policymakers. But I'm biased to think that connectors are going to be a huge part of this, and that we have to move back and forth in different spaces to see what's going on in the maker space and inform policymakers to be like, 3D printing is coming and they are printing bacteria in space. So let's think about that, right?
Excellent. So I like what you said about having connectors that can speak different languages for different groups, and I think that is key. For our final panelists, and definitely want to highlight the work that's being done by the company he represents, would like to introduce Peter Marquez. If you could real quick introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your role, and give us your thoughts about, why does this matter? What has changed, and what should we be thinking about when we think about space economics and sustainable space infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. So David, first of all, thank you and Geotech and the folks at the Atlantic Council for putting this together and for having me here. This has been great. And I'm not sure what else there is for me to say because I think, Reggie and Pete and Joanne kind of covered just about everything and did it really well. Just a very quick background. I am now the head of space policy at Amazon Web Services. I think later on in our discussion, you'll find out why is a cloud compute organization involved in space. We'll get to that in a little bit. Most of my background, I've spent, now that I'm getting old, I've spent half of my time in government and half of my time outside of government. So I've worked in 3 presidential administrations now, working space policy, national security background, but then on the private side, running a company, also working in the investment in private capital activities, and then also working with foreign governments on developing their own space programs. So I've had the luck of having a career in the space community, so I get to actually do what I like. So to answer your question about why is this changing, why is this happening now, I think there's a little bit of a short history lesson I can give here, and I'm going to grossly oversimplify what has been happening. But in the mid to late 80s, you had the Reagan administration that really started to embrace more commercial capability and was trying to promote commercial capabilities in space to some levels of success. It really wasn't there yet. Fast forward to the late 90s, you saw the first iteration of what was going to be the mega constellations. The technology quite wasn't there yet. The cost of launch quite wasn't there yet to make those things viable, but it started moving forward. In the late 2000s, during the beginning of the Obama administration, I worked on the national space policy and wrote the commercial section. And we went, some people said we went overboard. I don't think we did at all, and essentially set up a lot of the government structures to support commercial space activities. And since that time, the point I'm getting to is that the reason we're having this discussion now is the explosion of commercial space activities has really overtaken what a lot of governments are doing and the impact of those activities. So, my fellow panelists have discussed, orbital regimes and space traffic and handling those things. And I think later on in the discussion, we'll get into authorization and supervision discussions about what are the right entities to do all those things. One other thing that I would mention as well, even more difficult to manage than orbital slots, is that space is a big place, right? We still have plenty of room to move around.
Big. Yeah,
it's pretty big. There are some slots that are more important than others, but the one thing that is the most difficult to manage and is the most finite resource in the entire galaxy is radio frequency spectrum. And we aren't making any more of that. RF is what it is. And so working along those lines to make sure that all operators are working effectively and appropriately and working out a licensing regime that is fair and allows commerce to grow is another thing we have to work on. And so I think the amount of what is happening in space and the fact that space is so pervasive in what everybody does that they don't even know it anymore. What have I got? Receive Galileo, GLONASS, GPS, and QZSS on this. And most people don't even know that that's how they're getting around, is that I'm pinging 4 different satellite systems, 4 if I'm in the Asia Pacific. and the fact that we've carrying space capabilities around in our pockets is just maybe opaque to a lot of people, but it requires a significant amount of collaboration, choreography between both government entities and commercial entities and multinational groups, and it's just getting more complex. And so, as you mentioned before, norms of behavior, working through orbital regimes, radio frequency activities, all these things are important because space is just going to become even more and more important to everybody, and it's hard to understate how important or overstate. It's hard to say how important it is right now, and it's only going to become more important as we move out into doing things in lunar, in cislunar space, as we move beyond Mars, as we do the mega constellations like Kuiper, and putting data services and capabilities in everybody's pocket all around the world. It's a really exciting time, and there's great opportunities to do it right, and I'm really excited about that part.
Excellent, and I think you did a great setting of the scene, and maybe now there's actually a perfect pivot that I'll circle back to you and let Peter. Since you went last, you can now set the stage now. So who would you recommend? How do we govern this? I mean, recognizing that we may have developed things in the past that worked possibly for the oceans or things like that. This seems like an interesting challenge. Like, how do we authorize? How do we hold responsible? How do we do accountability? Recognizing we've only got another 33 minutes, so it's going to be fairly brief. But what would be your recommendation if you were to make recommendations both to the public as well as to policymakers in this space?
Yeah, so I'll keep it kind of brief as to if you look at what the kind of the core of where the foundation of what we can and can't do. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty is international law. It's what we all follow. And that very clearly says in Article 6, nations have the responsibility to authorize and supervise. So that falls back on individual nations. Here in the US, it's been the FCC for comms, it's been NOAA for remote sensing. We're starting to get into gray areas for what is on-orbit servicing, who authorizes that, mining activities, those types of activities. Who knows, right? And so we're working with commerce, we're working with transportation and others to figure that out. But then let's multiply that problem with every other country around the globe, and they have that same responsibility. So I think we have two things we need to work on, both in our own respective countries. How do we deal with that Article 6, meeting that obligation? But then we also can't come up with our own regimes that may be in conflict with other regimes. And so having these discussions in the ITU, having these discussions in the UN, other multilateral fora about what are best practices? How can we all be on the same page? Because the more people that can use space, the better it is for everybody. So let's not make this a competitive environment. Let's collaborate and graduate on this. So again, lots of great opportunity to move this forward. But again, it's really going to come down to coming up with the right regimes that allow us to be flexible and allow new technologies to flourish. So a very responsive regulatory regime that allows this to happen. I mean, in 1967, over 50 years ago, they created a treaty that is allowing all of these things to happen. Let's be careful so that in 2070, we've got technologies and capabilities that none of us are even imagining right now.
I like your perspective on that. Let's make sure we don't, we obviously want to work together, but let's make sure we don't hamstring innovation, and let's have the same foresight that was shown in 1967. So like you said, that we're celebrating in 2070, looking backwards and saying those were key things that set the foundation for the rules of behavior, but did not prevent or preclude things that later came up in 2030, 2040. So I'm now going to go to Reggie, and I'm going to go to Pete, and then to Joanne. So Reggie, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I really appreciate what Peter just said, being really an expert on the policy side. One of the things I think actually, David, you and I have talked about before, concerns the rate of change of technology with respect to the rate of change of policy. Mm-hmm. And so the policy, the legal frameworks clearly change a lot more slowly than tech. And so if you start using, kind of Joanne and your metaphor for this looking like the West, okay, so what are going to be the driving factors that are going to make things happen, right? So let's say, is it going to be a gold rush? And then, using Joanne's metaphor, who's going to make the jeans and the shovels and provide the rest, the food and the lodging and all these kinds of things? There's going to be this rush for that. And my concern is that our policy domains, our legal structures don't work fast enough. And how do we create a framework for thinking about and enacting those things more quickly? I remember when I was at the Pentagon, and I think I shared this with you before. I heard that to do a policy, to do some of that's going to take at least a year to get signed off in the building. Right?
And then you got to make it into doctrine and everything else, so even longer.
Exactly. Peter, you're in policy. You can address that better than I can. But I mean, that doesn't work when things are changing this quickly, like Joanne and Peter are talking about. With 3D manufacturing, these kinds of things. And how do we get our hands around that? The other thing I'm concerned about is if we use a different analogy, right? So the West is one, but another are the high seas, right? Mm-hmm. So another one of the commons. So what are going to be the real factors going to force us to do things, right? So in the late 1700s, 1800s, you had the Barbary Wars, right?
Right.
All of a sudden, the Navy gets involved. So now we have a Space Force, right? So how is that going to shape our Space Force? How is that going to shape our thinking with how we protect the commons of space like we had to do for the seas? And again, because things are happening so quickly, I'm concerned our infrastructure is going to find it difficult to be really strained to react fast enough to these kinds of changes and potential threats that we're not seeing.
Excellent. That's the scene very well, Reggie. So Pete, I'd be interested in your thoughts, and maybe if I could ask a slightly related spin on that, what would be the thing that would galvanize policymakers to say we've got to do things better? Or is it just the case that policy is always going to be out of sync and we've just got to figure out new ways to create norms outside of policy because policy will always be playing catch up?
Yeah, I actually believe that we have a great roadmap for this, and we don't need to overcomplicate it. Like I said earlier, the economies of space is the economies of the world. Space is now and into the future a major economic force. So the same way that we would look at an economic development program for a small community, an economic stimulus, which is a big topic of conversation right now for states and nations. We need to think about that economic policy and that economic development for space in the same context. So I think, without getting into a lot of the specifics, because we could do a whole session on this, but I think what is critical from a policy perspective is we stop thinking about expansion into space as some sort of exquisite or unique or strange path forward. It's really the natural extension of our economic development terrestrially into space with a better roadmap because we've been through industrialization before, so we can do it more responsibly. But fundamentally, the policies shouldn't change. I would submit that what is good for the space economy now is good for the world economy now. So I'm really interested in seeing policymakers start looking at the rules of commerce terrestrially and starting to apply those to space to include a framework that allows people to take risk, managing liabilities, while at the same time also promoting corporate responsibility, and all those things that go into having a good economy. But really, at the highest level, from a policy perspective, you've heard me say, David and Reggie has heard me say that physics will get you into space, but economics will keep you there. I believe that the hard problems of space are not how much we can put in orbit. We've pretty much solved that problem, but what are the business models? What are the government structures? What are the policies that are going to keep these constellations up, that's going to sustain these constellations for the long term? And at least in this country, we predominantly believe that you need a profit incentive in that. So that's another key factor that people have to take into account from a policy perspective, is that we make the economic decisions to ensure that there is a profit motivation for those corporations, or the proper incentives, I should say, for those corporations to continue to maintain their space infrastructure while they're up there. And again, I think we got a great roadmap for that in terms of any economic development that we've done terrestrially, and now we just need to start focusing some of that on the space economy as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete. And Joanne, maybe to build on that, I mean, you've worked in different government regimes. if Pete is saying, you know, that we have existing things about economic encouragement and entrepreneurship, maybe let's try and think about how we would apply that to space. Do we need to have the equivalent of a defense entrepreneurs forum for space, a space entrepreneurs forum? Do we need to have a USAID, but instead of doing international aid, it's actually trying to think about space aid? It sounds like we may need to have more coordination between Commerce and Department of State on some things internationally. But maybe from an entrepreneur's perspective, what would make the lives of entrepreneurs easier in terms of what the public sector could do to encourage entrepreneurs doing more in space?
Sure. So I think to answer that question, I would be combining the answer from Peter and Pete's, from the two Peters that we have on this panel, is that space is part of the economy. So I don't think there would be a separate forum for space entrepreneurs to operate in. It would just be, and we shouldn't, because we should all be just eliminate the stovepipes, right? And start all talking to each other and develop together. That said, I do think that if America or the American government wants to encourage the growth of innovation and startups in space at this stage, we would need to incentivize the innovation in a different way. And the reason why I say that is because the risks and time to runway or time to launch in any space product is still much higher and longer compared to all the other areas. But at the same time, the US can really benefit from a more innovative community to participate in space, because we do need to get a certain technical edge on the global stage, and that is going to be a huge card that we can play when we come to negotiation with other countries on building the space infrastructure. So we could benefit from a much more robust innovation community, but the incentive is going to have to be more understanding of risk, more understanding of failures, more understanding of providing resources for startups to get to a success stage, so that they can survive here. That has been a slow learning lesson for the DoD, I would say. In the beginning, they're still very risk averse. They're building the startup community the same way they would build their weapons, which is, I don't want risk tolerance. I have no risk tolerance. Everything has to work 100% of the time, be it anything, right? Like even is a very simple bracket nobody's ever going to touch, you still cannot fail. So a tiered system has worked fairly well for the DoD. It's still a learning system in that, if you're a certain tier, then you have to go through a certain Q&A process. If you are less than, a smaller tier, then you don't have to go through as much rigorous testing in order to field. And imagine the same thing could work for space. And I think that would probably go back to what Peter and Reggie were talking about in terms of building that infrastructure and building out what that means internationally. So the policies all have to be internationally recognized and agreed upon so that we can all work with each other in space. It's going to be difficult.
I agree. It's going to be interesting, challenging, difficult, and worthwhile. So we do have a lot of questions. Apparently, you all have triggered a lively set of questions, both from social media as well as from folks. So we're going to switch now a little bit early to the lightning round. I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, maybe try to keep your answers to like maybe 1 minute or so, and recognizing we can do deeper follow-up later. Would actually like to first go to Pete, and recognizing this is a question that's coming from one of our audience members who actually asked a question, which is, how do we ensure that international social justice is involved with less developed countries wanting to be a part of space as well? Do you have thoughts about, how can we make this so it's not just the domain of the superpowers or those that have enough money, but what can we do to also involve less developed countries in space as well?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. Again, I'll point to our terrestrial-based economic development institutions, and otherwise, right? Because again, space is just an extension of that. So the same way that we collaborate in terms of a global supply chain for space, the same ways that we look at, space can really be a joint sport, as we know here, looking at the International Space Station, right? So every country should have the opportunity to participate in worldwide collaboration efforts to put technologies in space like we already are doing on the ISS. So I think the answer to the question is to talk about space in our world economic forums and expand those economic programs that are already in place to include space and just derive the outcome from that.
Excellent. And I might even make a plug for a place called the Atlantic Council. Who knows? But
there you go.
Appreciate it. WEF also exists, but anyway. So would like to now turn to Peter Marquez, because we have a question that sort of said, while we've had in the past a conversation here at the Atlantic Council and some of the audience knows about ground station as a service, if you could real quick share what that is, and more importantly, what other sort of things on the horizon that you can share are you seeing that give you hope about additional sort of as a services in space that can be provided to the public and to the private sector?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for mentioning ground station. I think this question dovetails very nicely with the question you just asked of other Peter. So there's a few things. First, just to mention ground station real quick. Ground station is essentially a service that allows anybody to plug into where Amazon Web Services has built the facilities and be able to operate or receive data from their satellites. So again, this is getting to, if you are in a nation that is developing its capabilities, AWS has a system for you to plug in and get data and utilize space for your country. There are a few other things that we're doing as well. Just, one of the reasons I've been at AWS for a month now, and one of the reasons I went there is because it is the capabilities that you buy as a service. Rather than building an entire electrical power plant, you just pay your electric bill for the kilowatt hours that you use. AWS is no different. So the ability to go into some of these other countries where somebody has a good idea and be able to use edge computing to be able to scale your compute power, to run things in a virtual environment, to test out new ideas and new capabilities, and then scale them at a global scale immediately. This gets right to what we've talked about, the democratization of space and allowing users to come up with good ideas. One of the things that I did in the Pentagon was, just like Joanne had mentioned, spending all the time and all the money on trying to get that last 5% of capability used to drive me insane. Programs would die before we could get them into users' hands. And one thing that we're very focused on at AWS is get capability to people to come up with the great ideas, and then let them push the ideas out and innovate from there and find out what the customers want. And so that's what's really exciting, is what we can do with these capabilities that anybody can use. And making space available for everybody. So this is the super exciting part for me. And I know I'm just to be short on this. I've already had discussions with partners in Asia, had a great discussion with the head of the space agency in Gabon, and other places in Africa that I've already had discussions. Where can we start doing more in space? And that's the most exciting part for me.
That's very exciting. And while we've been talking a little bit about New World and the West, maybe this is actually like the early days of the internet, which is it's really about what's the infrastructure that can be rolled out so that then you can see the .coms, you can actually see other services and everything like that what we can maybe draw from is how did the internet create a foundation for entrepreneurs to then build on top of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do everything we can to reduce the barriers to entry and let smart people do smart things.
Excellent. Reggie, looks like you had a rejoinder or some additional thoughts that you wanted to share.
I just want to add on to that, because I think the ground station service is a great example of what you're getting as building this infrastructure that's accessible to all or to many. It's also things like GNU radios, right? I mean, there's a lot of different, if you start thinking about some of the fundamental pieces you need to put something up into space, you get the CubeSats, right? The 1U kind of specifications. These are things that are common, and the more common you make them, the more accessible they are, given Pete and Joanne's comments on this, the more the price comes down, right? And I think it's important to continue making these kind of standards such that you're getting a more modular way of building these kinds of satellites, with the accessibility of services like ground station service, commercial launch, you start making these things a lot more affordable. That's all I wanted to add, David.
Excellent. And maybe to build on that, actually, I have another question that we've asked, an audience asked, Reggie, if you're willing to tackle the debris problem. Recognizing we'd probably spend a whole nother hour on that, but obviously you've served in different government roles. You've also been in the private sector. Reggie, real quick, do you see things that give you hope about how we're going to tackle the debris problem, or is that something that's still on the horizon to be solved?
I think the answer is both. I mean, I think the reason I get some comfort is because there's been so much emphasis on it recently, right? Mm-hmm. And you see that people are no kidding taking it seriously. The international bodies are coming together to talk about this. I think my concern, though, is I don't want to say rogue, but for example, I'm sure you're very familiar with Swarm Technologies, right? So this is a company that went through the FCC to try to get permission to use certain frequencies. They were denied. Then they decided to launch anyway. For that, but they set things up. And so what makes me feel less good about this is because of the ease of folks getting things up into orbit. You can just do this without necessarily getting permission. My concern is you could have more problems than we've had in the past because it is so easy to get things up. And with all the proliferation in LEO, yes, space is a big area, but as you know, just a paint chip can cause a lot of problems when traveling at very high velocity. So the answer to your question is, I feel comforted that we're thinking about it more. I'm concerned because I think the threats are getting worse.
Agreed. With any explosion of use, there's always a risk that it just takes one little small thing to go wrong. And just like we saw with amateur radio, we eventually had pirate radio. We may see some interesting pirate satellites in the future too.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Jan, real quick to you before we sort of do the closing lightning round. We've seen where Defense and others have done efforts to galvanize entrepreneurs, and we've seen whether it's AFWorks or DIU or any of those. What would, if you had to make again, this is completely hypothetical, if you had to make a recommendation to, say, the SecDef or to overall public policies, how can you mobilize the interest of whether it's high schoolers, middle schoolers, or entrepreneurs? How would you galvanize their interest? Do we need space fairs or things like that? How would you galvanize their interest in using sort of the things like Peter was talking about with what AWS is providing and things like that? How would you mobilize interest in being entrepreneurial here?
Well, I think it's just going to be an availability of platform tools, which is something that Peter Marquez have been talking about, the AWS ground station. So the more platform tools that you allow people to have to tinker with, that would result in a reliable enough system to demonstrate an idea, the more you can get people to try things out. And the second thing that I think is really important for us to inject into the space domain is education. There's a lot of institutional knowledge in space. I think somebody in the Q&A even talked about doing research in NASA. And I know a NASA engineer who have been working on a bracket for 35 years to optimize it. And that's what it takes to send something in space in a really reliable way. Their stories and their knowledge are both going to be really important to get people educated enough to create something for space, while having enough consideration for important issues like space debris, justice issues, and things like that. Because policy is never going to really fully catch up to innovation. And in some way, we do need to rely on industry to come up with ways to balance all the forces of power so that we can have a sustainable infrastructure. And policy is just there to create a structure for them to all live within that. So I would say platform technology and education are the two big things I would push in order for a better space infrastructure.
Excellent. Well, we have a little bit more time, so we're gonna do sort of a slight variation. Instead of asking to close with your recommendations to policymakers, we'll get to that in a second. Instead, I'm gonna go down the order. I'm gonna go to first Reggie, then Peter Marquez, then Joanne, and then Pete. But I'm going to ask you to give your thoughts about, really what we're talking about is re-envisioning, eventually a second and third order effect is re-envisioning how companies operate using space capabilities, even if they're not putting it up themselves, re-envisioning how communities operate, and even re-envisioning how we govern. So recognizing that that's probably a challenging thing to think about, given the perspective of 2020. But if you could have sort of 2 or 3 tweet length recommendations real quick, maybe Reggie, if you could sort of share, how do we go about re-envisioning how we work given these capabilities that space is going to provide us?
It actually goes back to, I think, some of what Joanne said a little bit earlier, which is we can't be stuck in old thinking, right? We can't be. I think this whole idea of exquisite platforms, custom parts, everything is rad hard. It's a different model, and I think in order to fully exploit this, as we've said, as a number of people have said, we don't really know what the technology is going to be there, but we can't be constrained. I think the problems we're having right now, both from a commercial, or less from commercial, but definitely from a national security perspective, is being constrained by old think.
Excellent. Peter, first, Peter Marquez, if you could share your thoughts about what we can do to re-envision how we operate, how we live as societies and work.
Sure. And I'll try to keep it tweet length. I guess one of the bumper stickers would be, I think entrepreneurs and space companies should follow Chicago voting rules, and that is get in early and get in often. And that companies should really look to either having somebody on staff or having some proficiency to have their own space diplomat with extraordinary and plenipotentiary powers to work collaboratively with other companies and the international government communities to help create this correct environment. So Joanne says policy, can't be innovative or outpace innovation. I take some offense to that as a policy guy, but I get your point. She's absolutely correct. Policy sets the playing field. Now it's up for all of us space ambassadors to go out and start innovating and playing a good game on the pitch.
Excellent. And I liked how you talked about everybody needs to have a space diplomat, space ambassador. Maybe that can be the starting of the Federation. Who knows? Maybe we're actually on that path. So Joanne, your thoughts as to what we can do.
I like those titles. My recommendation to the space, infrastructure really is not too different from what I would recommend for any new innovation space. Is that I think first we need to understand how America wants to act as a country, what our morals are, what our ethics are, how we want to innovate, how we want to harvest innovations. And then from there, we adopt those philosophies, those ethics and morals into a totally different environment that we have never really operated as a country together before, right? Because is a totally different set of constraints, technologically speaking and culturally speaking. So as we're entering this, now that we're not, Columbus discovering America, we're Columbus and other people discovering America, but we know who we are now, hopefully, and we enter this conversation knowing who we are, and then we explore the constraints from there.
Excellent. And I liked what you said, which is it's thinking about, first, what are the values that we want to bring to this? And maybe a way forward is actually, Pete, you had said, maybe some nonprofit unknown could actually convene industry and government as well to say, what are the norms that we want to agree to? What are the rules we want to agree to? And build on what Joanne says. From there, then we can all move forward and innovate. Pete, I'd be interested in your tweet length recommendations too. Is how do we move forward, not just in terms of putting things in space, like you said, but making it so that it is sustainable and it's actually changing how we innovate here at home and how we work and how we operate.
Yeah, so through Redwire Space and our wholly owned subsidiary Made in Space, which is doing 3D printing in space, we talk a lot about the evolution of the space economy. And I think of it in 4 phases. One is the terrestrial application of space infrastructure. That's our satellites now. We believe the next phase will be the servicing of the infrastructure in space to maintain the satellites and infrastructure that we have up there that has a terrestrial application. 3 would be then building a commercial LEO economy where we are creating products in space, whether it be through material sciences, biosciences, pharmaceuticals, or whatever. That would be the 3rd phase. And then the ultimate phase is the human population of space, where it has its own economy and trade that is fully operational in space, whether it be through some sort of presence on the moon or otherwise. And we think that will be through those 4 phases, the economical impact that it'll have on the world.
Excellent. All right, so we've got about 5 minutes left, and maybe sort of as a variation for the closing lightning round, we did have someone that asked, beyond Leo, we've talked a lot about Leo and other types of orbits. Let's go beyond Geo. Let's now talk about the moon. Let's talk about Mars, asteroids, etc. If each of you could real quick give 1 or 2 tweet length recommendations for policymakers, but also the private sector to think about how we can do this collaboratively, how we can do this jointly. What would be your recommendations for how the private and the public sector can think, the moon and beyond? So not just Leo, but moon and beyond. And I'm going to go first to Peter, then I'm going to go to Joanne, then I'm going to go to Pete, and then Reggie, you bring us home. So Peter, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, so I mean, there's the geography of what is the moon and beyond, and then there's conceptually what is the moon and beyond. There's a lot, I think, that we've discussed on regulatory and other activities that we should be looking at and collaborating, and there's not much I want to reiterate there. What I would say is that if anybody thinks they know what the future should look like, I might disagree with you.
Right. You're probably right.
Yeah. So my tweet length summary would be is enable people to innovate and do what they do best. I will give one real quick plug. AWS has something called Activate. You can Google it, aws.amazon.com/activate. It is a project where Amazon will give startup companies mentoring, training, AWS credits to just test out their ideas. Just do what you can to see what's next, because none of us know what's next.
100%. Anyone who thinks they know what's next is probably.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it also it highlights that we really need to always be learning, because this is going to be as we make sense of this. All right. So Joanne, recognizing that none of us have a crystal ball, what would be the thing you would recommend for the moon and beyond for either the private or public?
That's a bold assumption of you, David.
You might. I mean, actually, you may have a working crystal ball.
I'm an engineer. You don't know.
That's very true.
I don't have one. Please don't rob my house. But no, I do think that is a fascinating question, because we're getting into exactly how space is different from Earth, if we're talking about the geography of space, if that could be a term at all. So that goes back into a more nuanced approach to defining policy. And I would actually go back to our conversation about orbits, who is allowed to launch, what should be launched, what are the ramifications, how should we deal with that? Maybe there will be a tiered system in terms of how much we know about a certain part of space. I don't know. Again, kind of going back to your comment about nobody knows the future, when we deal with an environment that we absolutely don't know everything about, there's just so much unknown. We could be falling into a black hole unknowingly, maybe not unknowingly, but there are so much stuff that we still need to explore in space, and I can imagine some sort of a tiered system to explore and build together. And if it's less known, then we do more collaboration. If it's more known, that we can have a conversation about economic benefits to each party, then we will have that conversation and be less collaborative, which is okay. So that's kind of how I imagine it.
Excellent. Recognizing there are trade-offs. I appreciate that, Joanne. There are no perfect solutions. There are simply considering trade-offs and uncertainty.
Right.
So real quick, Pete, your thoughts, and then Reggie. So Pete, what would you recommend?
Sure, real quickly, whether it be our immediate orbit, cislunar, or deep space, our governments start to think, we're at a point now where we need to stimulate the economy. Many people have talked about an infrastructure bill. I would submit that infrastructure bill needs to include a space infrastructure component to it. So the idea is humans are going to want to continue to push on into deep space, as you articulated. That's going to take economic stimulation, and that economic stimulation should be driving come from our policymakers.
Excellent. Very well said. Thank you, Pete. And Reggie, bring it home for us, please.
Yes, so I can't really add more than what the previous speakers did on the economic parts of this, but what I can add is more philosophical. And that's beware the frontier hypothesis. right? So if you think about the frontier hypothesis that really drove some mythology of the West and drove some other issues around the country's democracy, I think we need to consider how we go forward with what we're saying about this next frontier. So beware the frontier hypothesis.
Beware the frontier. And maybe real quick, Reggie, one additional thought, since you have children and I have children too, what would you want them to have in 2030 or beyond with Space or Beyond briefly?
Which is why I say beware that hypothesis. It's access, right? I mean, we talked about the beginning of this, David, right? It's the access. It's the access. Joanne talked about knowledge, the education. It's the access to this new environment just to do great things, right? We have no idea what the art of the possible is. I'd love my daughter to be able to explore that to the full extent possible.
Excellent. I really love that. Make sure we are thinking about access and education for all, given what space can be. Again, truly thank each one of you. Thank you, Pete, Peter, Reggie, Joanne. You all were amazing. This was a fascinating conversation. I look forward to continuing it with each of you. And thanks to our audience. Join us again every Wednesday, 12 noon to 1 p.m. Eastern, as well as available for replay for the next Geotech Hour. Thank you all, and thank you again for everything you do as positive change agents.